My name's Josh. I'm a co-host on The Imperfects, the son of Sri Lankan and English immigrants, and I call Australia home. I'd like to recognise the traditional peoples of this continent whose land was stolen nearly 250 years ago. In particular, we at The Imperfects would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners of the land on which this podcast was recorded, and we extend our respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I'm inspired by the strength and endurance of the world's oldest living culture, and we at The Imperfects pay homage to the traditions of story when we share stories on our podcast. The Imperfects is not a licensed mental health service and is not a substitute for professional mental health advice, treatment, or assessment. The advice given in this episode is general in nature, but if you're struggling, please see a healthcare professional or call Lifeline on 131114.
Quick! Is anyone here a doctor? Yes, her name is Dr Emily, and she's a psychologist. Please welcome to The Imperfects, our very own psychologist!
One of our favourite times of the month. Is that all right to say? Yeah. Yeah, probably not a good way to start. Well, it's that time of the month.
It is.
No, it's a good time of the month.
It's a wonderful time.
It is. It is. We have Dr. Em in the studio with us. Hi, Em.
Hello. It's great to be here. Back in the studio.
You. Yeah. And
I think it's disappointing for our listeners that they can't smell Em right now.
And why is that, Hugh?
Is it okay to say that?
Well, we'll find out.
Em
Wait for the feedback.
Em smells wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank
she
you.
does. It's beautiful. It's like a. Is it a special perfume?
It is a bit. It's not my just natural scent.
That'd be impressive. Yeah. That's probably in the future somewhere where people can get like their scents changed, like some technological advancement where you can get.
I would suggest Dr. M could be one of those scents you could choose because it's just like she just smells great today.
Oh, thank you.
Really great. It's a smell that I'm familiar with because I've smelled it before, and every time I smell that smell, I think, oh, that's my favourite smell in the world.
Oh, there you
Behind Jasmine. Behind Jasmine.
So don't get a big head, Em.
Jasmine Bush, number 1. Dr. M, number 2.
Okay, good. Just so to make it very clear of the rankings. Hugh's smell rankings.
Right.
Okay.
What an odd start.
Doctor, yes. An understatement of the day. Dr. M, today, like as we know, every time you come on the show, you reference one of our older episodes and then you'll expand in some way from a psychologist's point of view. So today, for your episode, which episode are you going to look back and...
So I wanted to talk about Linda Mariano's episode.
Yeah.
And so I think Josh will play a little bit of an excerpt. But this excerpt is in relation to, I suppose, the origins in some ways of the good girl. And then...
like being a good girl. Yep.
Yeah, and then also using that as a context to really understand perfectionism. So we can talk more about that after.
Awesome. Yeah, we've had a lot of people contact us about that and saying, yep, I see that in myself. A lot of people related to, Josh, your reflection on it, like saying, is it possible to be a lazy perfectionist?
Yeah,
a lot of people. In fact, our mum even mentioned that.
Yeah, that's true.
She was really quite moved by that. So I think it's great we're doing this.
There was such a pressure in being really resilient and hardworking and disciplined and like, yep, we can take anything. You can go to school. You're going to be the ducks of the grade. You're going to be very good. You're going to do very well academically, and that's it. No crying, no complaints, no laziness.
No pressure.
No pressure.
No vulnerability.
No, actually no vulnerability. No. You fell over and you cried, no. You don't do that. You suck it up. If you're feeling sick, you're going to school.
And this is from your mum? Okay.
Yeah.
And was your dad similar to that or?
No. Dad was the softie.
Okay.
Mum ruled the way that we were in our house, how we kept our rooms, how we did our homework, what we ate. It was totally mum, and it was really strict.
So how did your dad make you feel then?
Dad made me feel like I could go to him.
Yeah.
So...
Good cop, bad cop.
Yeah, totally. But Dad was almost like good cop, not invisible cop, but Mum was the rule.
The
Like
police
what
force.
she, mum was the police force. Whatever mum said goes. Like I remember unpacking groceries with my mum and, you know, dropping a jar of something. And it was that sort of strict thing where you don't play after school. You've got to do your homework. You're allowed to have afternoon tea. Then you do a chore. So I'd be cleaning, like I'd sweep the backyard or would dust bust the floor or like something, and then would help mum with the shopping or the washing. And I remember, I guess, kind of an example of the good cop, bad cop thing, which was like I dropped a jar of, like it was like a glass, it was a jar that broke, I remember, of like peanut butter or jam or something in the kitchen. And I was like, I'm so sorry. And mum like scolded me for dropping this jar. And I remember my dad had just gotten home from work and he came in and he was like, it's okay. It's all right, Linda, come here. And I remember running into his arms while my mum was, you know, cleaning up and being like, you're silly. You shouldn't have dropped that jar. You know, it was that kind of pressure and that expectation to always be a really, that you couldn't make mistakes and you always had to be a really good, I always had to be a really good girl. Really good.
Was the same standard applied to your brother?
Yeah.
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 God, I just almost listened to the whole episode then, didn't we? God, that is, I remember that. Of course I remember that. But what was that from? So perfectionism, because how does that childhood then sort of play out?
Well, it's a really good question, and I think it can play out in a myriad of ways. And interestingly, Josh, you know, you're talking about the lazy perfectionist. I think we can definitely get to that because perfectionism manifests itself so differently depending upon your temperament and your unique learning history. So, you know, I guess first of all, the thing for me that stands out about that excerpt are really kind of some of the main principles of almost of defining perfectionism, and that is that there is an unrelenting standard that is rigid and excessive, and it's coupled with hypercriticalness.
Hypercriticalness on yourself?
Yeah, so it actually can work both ways. So if we look at the origins of being a perfectionist, it can come from a number of different experiences, but one of them is receiving or experiencing really critical parenting. So in response to you making a mistake as a child, there is a high degree of criticism.
Like dropping a jar.
Exactly. Yeah. And, you know, Linda gave such a great example. You're silly. What's wrong with you? Why did you do that? Which is, you know, which for a child, the message is, I cannot make mistakes. So I must be perfect in order to be okay, really. And then they become, and I've said this obviously in lots of instances, but they then become your internalized messages about how you live in the world.
And does that then reduce your ability to take risks?
Absolutely.
So as you get older and you're like, oh, I won't take that leap, or I won't leave my job to do that other thing because I might fail or I might not be perfect at it. Yeah.
And it can spread to all areas of your life. So it might start with, so you might get feedback that dropping the jar was a stupid thing to do, but then that'll go, well, when I'm playing sport or when I'm playing music or academically or with friends, or you set yourself to go, I need to be perfect in all scenarios. Then is that kind of how that works?
Yeah, it can be. I mean, for some people, I think it can be there's a lot of striving in one particular domain, but for a lot of other people, it's quite pervasive, so it's across all of your experiences. But really interestingly, like I said before, it can present so differently. So you could have someone that actually does take risks, but it's accompanied by lots of striving. So really long hours at work. Excessive checking of your work. It can be letting other parts of your life go in order to really kind of put yourself into this particular job. And so there might be risk associated with the job, absolutely, but it becomes so rigid and so life narrowing, that becomes really problematic.
Life narrowing. What do you mean by that?
Like obsessive.
When perfectionism tend to show up, it brings with this kind of strong fight or flight response. And as part of that response, we tend to get a narrowing of cognition. So we tend to see that our thoughts are much more focused on that exact task and particularly avoiding failure. And so we tend then to not be able to have a greater capacity for perspective taking. So we can't see that there are other things outside of this particular task, for example, that might be really life affirming. So it might mean that I'm just thinking in terms of, like, for example, career choices. If you're in a very particularly stressful job and striving and achievement is really highly valued in that particular job, that it might mean that all of your efforts and your both internal and external efforts are focused on that to the detriment of other parts of your life. So we don't have the same capacity to focus on our relationships. We don't have leisure time. We don't have, time to learn new or other things.
Oh my God.
Wow.
The little person in my brain is just like ringing the bell like a madman, just going like, yes, yes, ding, ding. Because I feel like that is to kind of like throw yourself into a work task. Because if you're like, for talking about myself, I'm scared if I'm doing something, but I'm really scared of failing and I'm unsure and I've got a lot of self-doubt about like whether this will be even good or not. It's almost like the more time I spend just sitting in front of the computer working on it, even if I haven't spoken to Jam or my family or whatever for ages, it's like I don't even think about that. Is that what you mean by like that narrowing of focus? Because I just think like, well, if I just spend lots of time in front of the computer and just keep working till 1 a.m., genius will hopefully hit and I'll be saved and I won't
And
fail.
saved from what?
Criticism.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that's what really sits at the heart of perfectionism, is an intense fear of failure.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And if we go even below that, if we think about what it means to fail, it leaves you more vulnerable to criticism, rejection. I'm not lovable.
Yeah.
And almost like, is it like, what is below failure? It's almost like, for me, I'm just thinking for me, it's like, it's like if I fail, then I probably start questioning whether I should be doing it at all. Because you start thinking like, well, maybe the people who said try something else were right. Maybe I am out on a limb here. Maybe I should do a more traditional job with a more consistent paycheck, or something that I'm part of a bigger group, or I'm not holding so much of the responsibility because maybe I'm not ready for it. Maybe I'm not good enough to carry all this burden. Maybe I should be in like a bigger company and like play a role. Those are the questions that start cropping up if I fail at doing the thing that's like that I feel like I'm taking a risk by doing.
It feels like there's a slight strange, I don't know if paradox is the right word, but in that when you do narrow your focus and become obsessive with something, you do get very good at it. So you do achieve a level of success, or you're open to achieving a level of success. Whether you feel like that, I guess, is a question, but it's inevitable that you will reach failure. That must be at some point, because everyone does in that given pursuit. That must be particularly devastating for people who have narrowed their focus and their life so much to the detriment of everything else.
Absolutely.
And then to fail, that must be the ultimate blow.
There's a big cost to that effort. And I think that is such an interesting observation about it being paradoxical, that in some ways we need concerted effort to be achieving certain things. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But, is there a way in which, and I'll get to this in terms of how we work with this, but, really highlighting that when we bring so much striving to a particular thing, it comes at a cost. And that might be, the loss of other important parts of your life. Yeah.
Yeah, it's and in my mind, I've always framed, because I'm just, of course, as it always happens, making it about myself.
I do that.
Yeah.
I made your thing about me.
The lazy thing, I think I've always told myself that the kind of the lazy perfection thing in my mind is that like the fear of failure is so much that it's best not to try. And then I sort of had I don't know if epiphany is probably too strong a word, but this thought process of, well, of course you're not good at that because you're not doing it enough. You're not trying hard enough. You're not focused enough. And we seem to really reward the idea in the culture of work and success that the only way you get good at something is by putting in the 10,000 hours and this obsessive thing, as if that's a really good thing. But it feels really hard to find, like, where's the balance there? How do you achieve a high level of success and skill at a certain task without having an unhealthy attitude towards it or mindset towards it?
And I think there's a really important distinction between what's healthy striving and what's unhealthy striving, and part of it has to do with, even being able to experience the stress and contraction in the body that comes with the pressure to perform. So, if we can relate to the task differently, that there isn't so much pressure on you to be performing, then that might change the ease with which we can do the work. And
healthy striving versus unhealthy striving.
Yeah,
that's really interesting, because I feel like, just this obsession with, I think you're right, there's that, or whatever, the 10,000 hours to master something. So everyone's obsessively trying to get their flying hours up to be a genius at something or to be incredible at something. So, but you can do that in a healthy way as a really good, because I think about when I do talk, sometimes when I get off the stage, my left shoulder is so sore and my back on the left hand, and it's just when I'm really striving and trying really too hard and I care too much about it, I like my body knows that. Obviously my body's like, and then sometimes I'm just so relaxed and I feel, I guess that's kind of like,
that's a great example. So the body knows it. The body knows it. So I think, the tension in the body, the contraction, the tightness, even things like perspiring but not noticing that you've been feeling anxious, this is an indication that the body's sitting in this stress response. But there are times when you can engage in action that feels much more easy.
So that's just on the sweating thing. And again, to make this about me now, I notice I don't sweat much at all. Even when I'm exercising, I just don't sweat that much, which is really weird. But then I've noticed it when I get on stage sometimes, I have to be very careful with what colour T-shirt I wear. You can't wear grey, because I go, oh, you get sweat patches. And I remember once going, hang on a minute, I don't sweat. Why am I sweating when I'm cold wearing a T-shirt and not exercising? So that's a stress type thing, is it?
Well, it's certainly it's a stress response. And I could actually might go into this in more detail in another context. But there's a component attached to the physical response, which is how you think about it and how you feel about it. So we can have this stress response showing up, but we actually think really positively about our experience. So, for example, you doing a talk, you might be having a stress response, like the body sees this as a need for mobilization in the body. Like you need to be mobilized to do the talking. So therefore the body's responding accordingly, but there may not be the negative affect attached to it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry, I got you off track a bit there.
No, that's okay.
So the healthy striving versus non-healthy striving.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that really stands out to me about the difference between those two things is thinking about the end point. So, for example, when it comes to perfectionistic tendencies, is that we're often striving with the intention of avoiding failure or avoiding feelings of shame or blame. So when you reach that particular goal, so let's say you do get, even when you're studying, let's say you got an HD on something, and so you get to that point and it's come with a lot of stress, a lot of striving, lots of excessive checking, reassurance seeking, all that sort of stuff. And then you get the result. And then the question for me is so what happens when you get the result? And so often for people that struggle with perfectionism is that it feels primarily like relief that I've avoided failure. But but it doesn't come with pride. It doesn't come with joyfulness. It doesn't come with excitement, and it doesn't come with a pause. So for people that
And then you just go on to the next thing straight
exactly,
away.
yeah, yeah.
That
So
feels like my entire year 12.
yeah,
Relief.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, and disappointment.
and actually that is key, and that is that for a perfectionist, it's one of two things: I've done it or I'm terrible. So it's really dichotomous.
Yeah.
It's I'm perfect or I've saved myself from.
And the perfection is just relief that you hit that bar,
Yep.
not pride.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
So there is no real. So is what you're saying is there's no real joy in perfection, in finding perfection.
Yeah, that's a really
Wrong
I
way
feel
of saying
well,
it.
no, I think that's actually quite controversial, because I think that there are some people that would really feel a great deal of pride, for example, in the work that they've produced.
But how much of that is because there's a part of this is really resonating with me, because I read a book from Gretchen Rubin like 5-6 years ago or something, probably more, and she talks about process. Prioritizing process over product, and I think I've spoken about it on the show, but it completely changed the way that I worked in like writing comedy and writing, just making anything, where she talked about like to prioritize the process is what we should be doing and forgetting about the product. Obviously you want to be making something that you're proud of or that has some sort of that you like, but if you prioritize, if you're making something like this podcast, for example, the process in making this episode is our life. Like the time that it takes to record it, and then we edit it and talk about it and whatever it takes, all those hours, that's the time that we spend together, and we can either enjoy or we find really stressful. The product, once we put it out there, is people will either like it or they won't like it. It's sort of out of our control. But if you are doing everything to focus on the product and you don't care about what the process is like, then that's when you get stressed, and the product itself is like such a small part of the whole process. So if you're not prioritizing the process, you're not prioritizing your life. And that was a huge shift for me, and it kind of feels a similar ballpark to what you're talking about.
Yeah. Oh, I just feel like that sentence almost bears repeating. Like, if I'm not prioritizing process, I'm not prioritizing my life.
Yeah,
That's pretty significant, I think.
T-shirt.
Yeah.
T-shirt. It was very, very significant for me, and it honestly did. The work I made from that moment on, just the work I did for myself, was absolutely perfect. No, it was actually probably the stuff I'm most proud of, because the memories I have from it are from the making of the things, not necessarily from the feedback I got from it. Anyway, but it also affected the enjoyment of the joy that was connected to it, that is attached to it. Yeah. So, yeah.
Great.
Cool, bro. Cool story, bro.
It does. This is probably off topic now, but that does remind me of the thing we were talking about yesterday about that new Rick Rubin book.
Yeah.
And his idea of success is just getting something to a point where you feel comfortable sharing it with someone.
Yeah.
And that's all success is.
Oh, that's nice.
And past that, you have no control over anything.
Yeah.
Which feels like a similar sentiment, but
Yeah.
it's not really about perfectionism. So
Yeah.
I'll park that for another ep.
Yeah. But it
Kind of is a bit.
It's sort of
Yeah.
connected. Yeah.
Well, I guess it is. I think there's an acceptance that built into that is that it's never going to be perfect. So you just need to get to a point where you're comfortable with something to share it.
Yeah.
I had writing my second book, I did a whole chapter on perfectionism, and it dawned on me at 2 a.m. once when I was just poring over it, and I was just like, I was so stressed. I remember thinking to myself, this is not perfect yet. And I was writing a chapter on that, and I was like, I have to. So that's what makes me think it is related to that, because I wish I had the mindset of like, I'm happy enough to share this with people now. Like, it's not perfect. It's a chapter on perfectionism. It's not perfect. And I just wish I had that thing of like, I'm happy to share it though.
And that's so key too. Like, for me, about that whole process is that perfectionism can feel really lonely. And so those moments where you're sharing, it's like it starts to it can start to diffuse that striving part. So letting it go unfinished, I mean, that's a huge challenge, and we'll come to, how to work with that. But it just really struck me that, like, that example of like 2 a.m. It's a really lonely process being in that perfectionistic mind.
Can perfectionism be shared? Like if you're working as a team or a duo or whatever, can that team carry the same perfection and put the pressure on themselves as a team? Does that happen?
Yeah, I think certain workplaces certainly do that. That there's a culture of expectation and like a culture of like unrelenting standards. And as soon as we've achieved this bar, then the bar is set higher again.
Yeah.
So absolutely, certain workplaces can really reinforce that tendency.
I've been going through. I've been wondering whether I should bring this up because the timing of when this episode will be released and what we're doing. So maybe we can cut this out. But I thought I'd bring it up. Might be an interesting discussion. For our live shows, I've got to do something that's really, really vulnerable for me. Well, I guess this will be released after we've put some live shows out there. So hopefully I will have performed a song I've written to people, lyrics and all, which is very, very daunting. I've got about 4 words at this point that I'm happy with. But I found that when I first sort of started thinking about this process in about December last year, I was in a really good headspace about it and felt good and felt like I was a new person approaching this task. And then I've had things are busy and I had a setback where this guitar I bought to write it on got stolen and then I just sort of have gotten into a bit of a rut, and I'm finding that I'm in this old thought pattern that I used to be in when I was trying to write music years ago of this song has to be as good as like something off, like I've been listening to a lot of Bon Iver recently. It has to be as good as that or it's a failure. Like I have to make this perfect and I have to make it better than like so exceptional that like it blows everyone away and everyone's like, whoa, this guy's amazing. And that thing of me being what you were saying before about me being okay, it feels very cognitively like it comes back to that like I'll be a failure if I don't hit that bar. So as you can imagine, I haven't been able to write much recently.
But can I just ask what is your measure of perfection? Like when you think about Bon Iver, like what do you see? Like because it's the quality of that is you could describe it in so many different ways.
That whatever I do evokes the emotional response for the entire audience that I get when I listen to a song of his.
Yeah, no pressure.
Yeah, pretty. Yeah, I know. It's ridiculous to say out loud, but it's like suffocating on the ability to.
That's a crazy standard to set yourself. Like considering. Yeah.
So the thought, I hope you don't mind, Josh. The thought was kind of going through my mind as you were saying that. Well, there were a few things, but the first one was, imagining that you do reach that. What do you imagine would happen?
I mean, there's a fantasy that, the fantasy is so unrealistic, but it's feeding these old desires of like people just thinking I'm brilliant at that. So I think the fantasy is that I'll get validation and recognition that I never quite achieved in a past life. Yeah, but yeah, I think I'm probably like we've done enough shows and talked enough for me to know that it's probably going to be a fleeting, and I've actually created enough stuff in my life that I'd liked to know that the feeling of satisfaction on something if you do go with that product over process, the feeling of that was good enough lasts for about 2 minutes or something.
Yeah, and that was,
and then disappears straight away.
And that was my next question: is that imagined outcome worth the costs of getting there?
That's a good question. I do feel like there's a previous me and a new me since having children and making the show. Previous me, I definitely would have said that the cost is worth it. But I'm not so sure now. But I'm not ready to, because I think I still really want it. So I'm not quite ready to say that the cost isn't worth it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Would be about as honest as I think I could answer it. Yeah. But the reason why I brought all that up is because when you were talking before about that feeling of enoughness and okayness, and yeah, I think it does all come down to that. That's like the acorn at the middle of all that noise. Yeah.
Being enough?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, yeah.
being enough, which I haven't felt like I needed for a very, very long time. But for some reason, I think it's the process of trying to write music is sort of, to use maybe overused words, is a little bit triggering of old emotional thoughts and patterns and things that were going on years ago. And I'm like, it's hard to try and do the activity that was so strongly linked to those thoughts again without them. It's like they come in as part of the process. And to be honest, whether I get there or not, as in write a song for the live show, I think is basically about whether I'm going to be able to push through these emotions and the perfectionism. Yeah.
Absolutely. And they really kind of highlight, the origins for us of perfectionism and those unrelenting standards.
Yeah.
And if we look at the function, I think this is really important too in recognizing is that there is a really adaptive function, and I probably say this all the time, but there's a really adaptive function to perfectionism as children.
Meaning we adopt that behaviour or that way of being as a way of fitting into our environment or surviving in our environment.
Yep.
Is that, yep.
Yeah. So, if you think about a child who has, there's so many different ways in which this occurs, and I've said this at the beginning, but if we think about having highly critical parents, it would have been really dangerous not to be aiming to be perfect, to achieve or to avoid punishment. Yeah. So it's a really adaptive skill that we're striving as little kids, because it means we avoid punishment, criticism, or we actually secure this sense of feeling loved and feeling seen.
Yeah, I feel sorry to jump in. I feel the need to say that our parents were not hypercritical and were very loving, and I think my thing stems from not from anything to do with them, but the timing of the eating disorder that came into our life and my attempt to fill a role of perfectionism then to try and make everything and make sure I wasn't causing any issues.
That is exactly what was standing out to me, and that is that there are, like I said, there are so many different manifestations in how this happens, and one of them is that if I am perfect or if I'm striving to achieve and not cause any problems for my parents, then that keeps everyone safer.
Yeah.
So if I'm almost like flying under the radar by not causing any ripples, I'm, getting the marks that I need at school, I'm not having any problems, I'm obedient, all those things really functional and help you feel safe as a child. And it also, you see the reinforcing benefit from your parents, for example.
Yeah, because it is helping at the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's amazing, because I don't have it so much anymore, but I, in fact, only recently managed to let it go. But I adopted, when Josh was adopting his perfectionism around that stuff, I developed my own version, which was socially, in social situations, I will be perfect.
Oh, yeah.
That was my thing, because at the dinner table, when someone's quite sick, if you can facilitate a really fun time, that's very well, that's a great thing to be able to do. And so that became my thing, but it didn't just stay at the dinner table of my family. It was like all social situations. Yeah. And it was only recently I've managed to not feel the pressure to do that. But yeah, so that's funny that we were 6 years apart, but developing, as a result of that, we're both developing our own perfectionist traits.
How important is it, do you think, for people to, exactly what both of Josh and Hugh just did, but to acknowledge where the perfectionism comes from, whether it be through therapy or however, is it an important thing to be able to kind of self-analyze or to do talk therapy of some sort to pinpoint what it was that kind of led you to this perfectionist lifestyle?
I think yes and no. I think from a therapeutic point of view, most therapeutic approaches really are in some ways about uncovering these automatic default experiences, both internal and external. And so for me at least, it feels really important to understand, how it is that these ways of being now were helpful for you in the past, but maybe not so helpful now.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
But there are things that we can do in the present moment that don't require you to have really in-depth therapeutic experiences of knowing what happened when you were a child. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it's both. I think we can certainly do things without having a full kind of in-depth understanding of your internal experience as children. I think it can be very beneficial to know. I think from, particularly if you're seeing a therapist who's using a schema approach, then understanding the development of internal schemas that arise through early childhood experiences is fairly fundamental.
Can you explain schema?
So it's a core belief
Okay.
in essence.
Yeah.
And it informs how we relate to people in the world. And, to come back to your point, Josh, about being kind of triggered, it's that those schemas will get triggered in certain contexts that are similar.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. And come to think of it, it's no coincidence that I started playing music, singing and performing at the exact same time as this as well. And it was became a thing that I was good at and got a lot of credit for at the very time I was trying to be perfect. And it was kind of my, so it's kind of maybe that's linked to that. I hadn't thought of that until then, but that the music is sort of linked as well. It's tethered to that core belief more strongly than other aspects of my life, because I certainly don't feel it with basically anything else now.
Well, your performances of Pete Murray and Jack Johnson are still talked about at assembly, the assembly performances. Because Penny was the year below Josh at school, and everyone remembers Josh's assembly performances. So I think it sounds like they were quite perfect.
Wow. Well, it's probably because he was performing topless. Josh, when you were writing, other than doing the covers, but when you were writing music, was any of it about your current experience then? Like, were you writing about that?
You mean lyrically?
At home? Yeah, lyrically.
Current experience.
Or whatever your life was like, were you writing about what was going on in your life?
I never went too far down the path of writing lyrics. It stopped.
Oh, you
pretty
didn't?
early.
Okay, yeah, okay, sure.
Like I didn't. I wrote a lot of music for people. Like I played in bands with people and would write music parts, but would always avoid lyrical content.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
After the Notebook incident.
After the Notebook, not the film. The incident.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because that was probably
the incident
20,
is something you talked
21.
about on the show, and we'll link to that episode so people know what it is. Yeah.
So you say that it's really helpful to have. It can be helpful to identify what causes it, but there are things you can do in the moment to sort of divorce yourself from those feelings. I'm interested to know what those things are that you can do.
So there are heaps of things actually, and I should preface this by saying that these are just a number of strategies, and they're certainly not all of them. And in preparing for this podcast, I was like, oh my gosh, there's so much information that I could talk about this for a long time. So these are just some small things to have to pay attention to. But the first thing for me really is looking at or a reflection upon what are the costs of this behaviour for me. So getting a sense of, is this the way I want to live my life? Sometimes a really useful exercise, and this comes from acceptance and commitment therapy approach to do with kind of identifying values, but sometimes it's really helpful to, even imagine being 80 and looking back on your life and thinking about how it is that you want people to remember you. And sometimes in that context, it's also really useful to identify, how much will it have mattered that I've spent an extra 5 hours on this particular thing? And is that cost, though, really worth it in the end? So I think, first of all, really having some time to reflect upon what is this costing me? And for me, a simple example of this might be, and this is relevant for people that have kids and doing birthday parties. How much time goes into making the cake?
It was Charlie's birthday party on Sunday.
Yeah, right.
A couple of days ago.
Yeah, and so how much time goes into it, but also what is the striving attached to it, for example? So making the cake may feel really joyous and it may feel really fun, and this is something that you're doing for your child. But for some people, it may feel really stressful that it must be perfect. It must be looking this way for my child. And what happens to your experience of joyfulness in those moments? And also what happens when you bring the cake out and there are a million kids here and like people are blowing candles and then someone puts their hand in the cake, you know, what's happened to that experience for you? And so again, this question is like, is the cost worth it for me? The second part of that is thinking about this kind of notion of the law of diminishing returns. So if I only get a 5% extra outcome on this, again, you know, is that really worth the striving that happened for me?
I think about it in terms of like if you have people over for dinner and you're cooking dinner and there's some people put a lot of pressure on themselves to make this create this incredible dinner party experience. And it's very stressful and it's like getting these incredible ingredients. But as a dinner party guest, the dinner parties that I really love and remember don't often have a lot to do with the quality of the food. It's the feeling of the night and the people who are there, and the chats we have. It's just like it's the way that you feel during that dinner party. But as a dinner party host, often the stresses are about like, well, make sure we get the good salmon, or make sure it's like. But at the end of the day, I think that is that law of diminishing returns, where it's like just because you've spent $5 more on that pasta and you've got it perfectly al dente, that isn't really going to affect the enjoyment levels of the guest.
I would say it's going to lessen it, come to think of it. Because having been the person who tries to get the $5 extra salmon in there I've done it many times and failed, because then as the host, you're sitting there going, is that
no one's mentioned the salmon.
No one's mentioned the salmon. No one mentioned how good that pasta was good. No one's mentioned it. And I'm not getting the credit that I deserve for the days I've put into this.
And even in
so
that.
So then you're out of it and you're not.
Yeah. And then you get this exposure to shame or blame or failure. But you don't get connection.
Yeah.
Yeah,
absolutely.
That's a really good one.
Such a good one.
It's that great thing. Who said, I can never remember who said things. I can't remember if I heard it on a podcast or someone said it on this podcast, but it's that line. I'm pretty sure someone said it on this podcast. Maybe it was you, Em. Don't try and impress people, like try and make a good impression on people. Is that right?
Yeah.
Did someone say that? Did you say that?
Make a connection, not an impression?
Maybe it's that.
Is that what I said?
Maybe you said that, yeah. And I think about that a lot because I feel like naturally we try and try and make a good impression, try and impress people when we meet them, maybe tell them about something that you've done in the past to try and impress them in a way so they'll think that you're really talented or you're worthy of their time. Whereas like when I think about it though, it's like, yes, making a connection and just focusing on that and not trying to impress them in any way, that was huge. I think about that a lot. So thanks, even though I forgot you said it.
Well, it actually wasn't me. I can't attribute that it was actually me specifically, but I did say it in the podcast.
Oh, yeah. Well,
so it was Ron Siegel who said who's original.
Siegs.
Don't want to be claiming things that I haven't said. Yeah. So following on from kind of really having this moment of being able to reflect upon the costs of these experiences for me, I think we can also be a little bit playful around, well, how can I make small efforts to change how I relate to these striving experiences? And part of that might be, let's just say you're organising a dinner party and picking something small that you can cut a corner with. So choosing something that feels really manageable and seeing if I can practice cutting a corner and tolerating the feelings of discomfort that arise in not doing it perfectly. So we don't want you to jump into, like for example, for me, if I just came in here and I hadn't prepared anything, that would be too much. Like I would feel like that would be too exposing, and it would possibly reinforce for me, other things. So you don't want to cut corners on things that are really important and like initially, but practicing exposing yourself to little moments of discomfort and potential failure is really helpful. So it starts to expand our capacity to be with those uncomfortable feelings that show up.
So you make a packet mix cake instead of a cake from scratch. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
And just see how that feels. And so then we get this evidence to say, actually, it wasn't as catastrophic as I thought it would be. because that's usually what happens, is that the mind gets so busy predicting how catastrophic the outcome will be if I don't do all of these things.
So this is exposure therapy you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, in
form
some ways. And I think that's probably the key for most, working with most uncomfortable thoughts, feelings and sensations is we need to learn how to be with all of those things, and that is exposure.
Like leaning into the discomfort.
Yes.
Yeah.
In a sort of safe, incremental way.
Yeah.
That makes it
I
totally
guess in the I'm just going to the example of the cake, but if it's like making a premix one, just going, it won't taste as perfect as the one I was going to make, but I'm getting an extra 45 minutes with my kids who I'm making it for in the first place to impress them. So that's the cost.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So then we can have a look, when we're doing those sorts of little experiments, is just to pay attention to our internal experience. So maybe noticing, is my body feeling tight and contracted? Do I have like some kind of like rushing feeling in the body? Like a rushing feeling in the body is very common when we're in that kind of perfectionistic striving. So if we cut a corner and we go, okay, this feels pretty uncomfortable, but I've also dropped the striving. So what's that like? So this kind of moment of being really able to notice, pause, take a breath. How is this feeling when I'm cutting this corner? Self-compassion becomes really, really important when it comes to working with perfectionism, because the inner critic is so strong for someone that is highly perfectionistic. They go side by side. If I am not perfect, then my inner critic is very loud. So the practice of self-compassion becomes so critical in my mind.
Yeah.
So in order to practice self-compassion, what I had to do, what was really powerful for me was understanding why I wanted to be perfect in social situations. So to go back what we were talking about before, thinking I wanted to be perfect in social situations to try and create a lot of fun and love in my family at a really challenging time. I look back on that and I think, well, that makes total sense. Of course I did. And I think that's a really good thing that I did that. And so, but that understanding that enabled me to be more compassionate with myself now, to when it pops up, if I'm in a social situation, I think, I'm not really offering much here, or haven't seen anything funny here, or I think it's okay, you're not sitting around the dinner table with your family, trying to save people from this is just a very lovely time that you're having. You can just be interested. You don't need to be performing here or whatever it is. So understanding the root of the problem for me was huge there, because that enabled me to practice self-compassion. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes.
So is it kind of like acknowledging what's the intention behind the striving? Sort of knowing what the intention is at any moment.
And then empathizing with yourself to go, you empathize with that version of yourself that thinks that it needs to perform in that social situation. I'm like, yeah, mate, you don't. Yeah. It's so nice that you want to, and I get why you want to, but you don't need to. You can just listen to people and that's fine. So can we go through them just in order?
Yeah.
Have you got more, obviously?
I do.
Okay,
I've got so many, but we will be here all day otherwise.
Okay, so the first thing we've talked about is picturing yourself as an 80-year-old and you're looking back on your life and you're trying to think about the way you'd like to be remembered. So that's the first one. The second one was the law of diminishing returns. The third one was practicing exposing yourself to not being perfect and just seeing how that actually feels. And then the fourth one we've talked about just then is practicing self-compassion. Yep.
What
else
so
you got for us?
they're the first. What are the next 96?
Yeah,
Or
exactly.
100, I'm assuming.
This is like my perfectionistic striving coming in. Get it all in. There's a couple of things that feel important to add in there. The first is self-care. And I know this feels so cliched, but I really would invite people to think about, how are you actually practicing self-care? And are those practices maybe even also buying into that striving? And I'll give you an example. Let's just say, the self-care practice is exercise. And so we find someone will go out and do a run. And so when I ask them, what was that like? And they're like, well, it's pretty stressful. I was like, why is that? Because I was timing myself to the minute. And yep. Yeah.
Could we,
Sounds cute.
could we stop the
That was
podcast a
Hugh's
minute
noise.
so we could, that was me, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that the act of
Shit.
that although that part of your experience is framed as self-care because I'm
Yeah.
getting exercise, that actual experience comes with a stress response.
Oh, God, what's wrong with me?
So And like even personally for me, like when I pre-children, when I used to go running, I definitely used to run to time. And something changed for me, I don't know, for various reasons. I now just run till I feel like stopping, and I don't take a watch, and it's completely different.
That's, yeah. I mean, Hugh's going to have more to say about this than me, but just on that, I was at a swimming pool. I've started doing swimming laps, and I saw someone I knew there, and I said, "Oh, how many laps are you?" Because I'm like up to 8 laps, and that's like big for me, having never been a swimmer. And I said to this woman, I said, how many laps are you doing? And she's like, oh, it was the weirdest question for her. She was like, oh, I don't know, I just exactly what you just said. She was like, I just swim till I have to go. And
that's you told me that story yesterday. It stressed me out all last night
because I was like, okay, well, yeah, because for her it's just like it's the act of just it's mindfulness for her. She just likes the act of swimming. Whereas for me, because I'm starting, I want to get better, and for me, I'm counting my laps because I'm doing only 8, which is good for me. But yeah, it's I guess it's different for different people. But I can't wait till I get to the point where I'm not counting.
Yeah.
Counting stresses me out.
Yeah. I mean, my thing very quickly is that during the week when I'm training, I love it so much, and I have so much data on every single thing that I do, so I know my exact times, and I'm okay with them fluctuating. It's just when it gets to the weekend and I have a race, if it's slower than the weekend before, like absolutely shattered and just ruined and I know I shouldn't be. I know I'm like, well, it's just like slower conditions today. You weren't as fast today. But it is just devastating. Yeah. So you're like, why am I doing all this training for when I'm actually getting slower?
And so that's that space of really moving into self-compassion. So, it matters to you, right? So, and that's important. It matters to you that you're improving or that you're progressing. And so I feel disappointed. And so then we can really, even in that kind of sense or feeling of failure, you can still bring in, this feels hard for me. And, hand on your heart, taking a few deep breaths, like really acknowledging that this difficulty is here right now, grounding your feet on the floor, and even so just labeling and acknowledging that this is what's happening. And it's okay that you feel disappointed. So then the question is, in terms of like self-care for me, is how...
Sorry, I really derailed you there. You're going to say something really
but like choosing things that genuinely almost bring you a sense of playfulness. So, things that don't have an outcome. So things that you can just go and do without there needing to be like a marker of achievement. Or even things like if let's just say massage is something that, you might get the luxury of being able to do. If you're having a massage, are you striving in the massage? So like, are you able to let go of the busy mind, or can you come back to the sensations in the body? Does that make sense?
It's funny you say that, because I've never thought about this before, but when I've had massages in the past, the thought does go through my head as like, I'm going to be so relaxed that the masseuse is going to be so impressed with how relaxed I honestly think, because you know how like when you first get a massage or something, you're tense, and they sometimes have to say, just relax, just relax. Yeah. And so I'm like, and I try not to flinch at all when it gets heavy, because in my head I think like, God, they must be thinking he's good at getting massages. I honestly think that.
I do a weird thing of like, I strive for them to go like, God, you needed a massage. Like, you are so tense.
You strive for the opposite.
Yeah, I strive for them to be like, that's one of the most messed up backs I've ever. Because you are like, it's like I want to be validated that I needed one.
So my massage story very quickly is that I got a
is this okay for on air, mate?
I got a remedial massage over the summer holidays, and it was a lady I'd never met before. And so I just, to make conversation halfway through the massage, I said, so how long have you been doing this for? And she said, about 25 minutes. Oh, no, sorry. Okay, good.
That's great.
Anyway, sorry.
Oh, dear. Yeah, so self-care, seeing if you can find things, like really having some time to think about what are the things I can do that are genuinely about nourishment rather than achieving or striving.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's something to really kind of have a moment to reflect on, I think.
I think all three of us are trying to think what that is.
I know.
Yeah.
I'm just personally thinking of me flying the kite, which I've obviously mentioned before.
Oh, yeah.
That's definitely an example. There could be things like making things with your hands.
Sorry, have I missed something? You flying a kite?
I'm sure I've mentioned in the
You
past,
have.
like my joyfulness in flying a
Yeah.
Oh, I
kite.
missed that.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Was
Yeah.
it a present for your children?
Yeah, it was
enjoyed more
definitely
than-
not for me. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I just went for a
Mind you.
kite. We've got Charlie for his birthday this marble run thing that it's like magnets and clip things, and you can make all these different tracks and loop the loops. I love it so much. Like
Yeah.
and it's every time I go to play with it, it's a real like I've just got to make sure I'm not over like letting him play with it, because I feel like we go to play with it together and I'm sort of not letting him explore it enough because I just love it so much.
Yeah.
His toys are great.
Yeah.
I took my nephew, Ashton, to laser tag for his birthday. And because I don't spend a lot of time with kids, I don't have my own kids. And I forgot to not try my hardest at laser tag. And so I absolutely smashed him. And he did not enjoy it. I pre-bought 2 games. He only wanted to play one. Because I was
You
like,
went in for this. Just wait out here, actually.
yeah, like Jan was taking, like I've watched back videos and I am like walking like a SWAT team. Like I'm taking it so seriously. There's one bit where Ashton's like, he's like 8 and he's like right behind me, just following me, and as soon as I come back to life, he's shooting me and he's having a great time. And I got genuinely annoyed. I was like, you can't just follow me around. Chilled out after that.
And the other part of this too is in terms of goal setting is thinking about how you set goals that are genuinely consistent with what you value, as opposed to setting goals that buy into that perfectionistic tendency, which may be goals that you think others want you to reach.
And that which is a bottomless
it's
well.
huge. Yeah.
It is absolutely
Yeah.
bottomless.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you will never achieve that.
Yeah.
From what I,
Yeah.
it's like you never, if you're basing your goals on what you think other people will find impressive, it's a never ending
On the
chase.
on the topic of the cake, I think that I have quite a high level of perfectionism attached to cooking to a degree, and I'm trying really hard to rid myself of it. And what I do want praise from my mum, especially because she's a really good cook. And it was Charlie's birthday on Sunday. I made this cake, and I put a fair bit of effort in. I felt like I was being quiet. I was like doing because there would have been a much harder cake to make, and I went for an easier version. So I thought that was pretty good for me. And then I called Mum to talk to her about it and tell her what I was doing and ask some questions. And she was like, I always just made packet mix cakes for your birthday. And I was like, the only person I thought would have cared and noticed and I'd already made the cake by that point. So, but it was an interesting thing of like, I realised I was doing that for her approval, not for my own.
It certainly wasn't for Charlie's.
No. As if the 3-year-olds are going to know the difference between a chocolate cake that's got Lindt chocolate or it's packet mix.
I feel like the pressure on making kids' birthday cakes, the blame for that lays squarely on Hamish Blake.
I was going to say before when you were mentioning, I was like, I hope Hamish isn't listening to this because I want him to keep making those cakes because it's bloody great content.
That's interesting too, it's actually in the end, no one really, like from what I can see, no one really cares what it looks like. It's the end. It's that whole process of watching him doing it, which is exactly what we're talking about is
And the fun,
joyfulness.
the joy,
Exactly.
the excuse to drink that much whiskey.
Yeah. So that's a great example of like process over product and really being very present. Like this is exactly what I'm doing right now.
Well, on the cake, I make Benji's cake every year and he chooses what he wants. And I don't do Hamish-like stories. I always just do a before and after. And this year he wanted a pirate. And we were down at the beach and so I had less resources and, I was less organised. And the end product it just looked strange. By far everyone's favourite. Like, everyone thought it was hilarious. It didn't really look like it looked ridiculous. Yeah. Benji loved it. The response on social media was so much more love for it because it was so far from perfect. Some of the ones I've done I've been quite happy with. They're like, it's good. People loved it, the imperfections of it. And so did Benji. Like the eye patch. He was like, he goes, what's that on his head? Because it just didn't look like an eye patch. And I said, it's an eye patch. And he found it really funny that was mine. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's like it was a really nice reminder to me that the imperfections are what connect us so often. It was the irony of the irony of this whole conversation really is that, or this whole, not the conversation, the irony of the topic is that we strive for perfection to belong and to be loved and to have approval. And yet what connects us more than anything, I think, is the imperfections of our journey.
Yeah.
Oh, it's like perfection is very hard to relate to. Like you
Isn't
can't.
it?
It's like watching someone do something perfectly is like, well, they're on a different level than me. Whereas like watching someone stuff it up, like watching someone run a 100-meter sprint, I want to hang out with the guy who like falls over halfway through, rather than the guy who like sets a new record. And like, oh, well done, that's great. But we're not going to have much to talk about. I'm going to have a lot to talk about with the guy who fell over. Like he seems great.
I was planning to show the replay of my race from last night today. I don't think I'll show you that now because I didn't fall over.
I may be milking the cake analogy a bit too much, but or story, but I did it a different way. I made it with Charlie, but it was a really what you were saying before about when you're 80, looking back in your life of the person you want to be. I often think about my own many behaviours about what I'm projecting to my kids, and I don't want to project perfectionism to them at all. So making this cake with him was a really it was like a high level cognitive task of like it involved. It was a rainbow cake, so it involved sorting all the M&Ms into colours and then lining them up on the cake. And he was helping me. He got them all in different colours. We started putting them on, and he started putting them in the wrong place.
Oh,
and I had this thing of like,
that's tough.
And I reckon I probably overdid trying to get it right as opposed to just having a good time with him. But it was this continual
There was a
thing
discomfort.
of like,
There's a discomfort that was showing up, right?
oh yeah. And I was like, that's the green. You should put a green on the orange line there.
It's
And
Roy G.
and so
Biv.
I had to like take it off and move it back.
And even as you describe that, I can see
Roy G. Biv.
the rainbow.
Yeah, red, orange, yellow, green, blue.
I did not know that.
Yeah, Roy G. Biv. Yeah.
This is such a helpful podcast.
And I knew I was like,
That's the thing.
that's the thing that everyone should remember.
Listen to Dr.
Connection.
M. Roy G. Biv.
That's the title of the app. I knew connection is more important here than getting it right, but I couldn't help but get the rainbow right.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing example.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's just one other thing, or there's, as I said a million times, there's lots of other things, but there's an author and therapist, Lynn Lyons, in the States, who I think provides a really great kind of question or reflection point that got me really thinking about the statement, just do your best. And actually how problematic that becomes for someone that's a perfectionist.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Just do your best.
Yeah.
That's all it's required.
Yeah.
So when we say that, I mean, when we say that to kids, for some kids it's completely not an issue.
Yeah.
But for perfectionists, like when there are perfectionistic tendencies there, this is like, well, how do I know where my best is?
Oh,
like,
wow.
how do I know when to stop?
Great question.
And I think that is a really important kind of way of reflecting upon this kind of unrelenting standard of achievement. And so then, like, in response to that is like, okay, well, what do I do about that then? And so, you know, if that is the case in terms of that kind of statement, we do need like some kind of criteria to judge when we've finished or when we've done enough. And so, like, within a working context, it might be something like setting time limits. So 5 hours is like, that's when I'm tapping out. So that has to be the end point. In my experience with some perfectionists that are very kind of driven to be doing the hard work, that they don't really do drafts. So the product is in its completion. At the time, there's no such thing as doing draft work because every sentence, every word needs to be exactly how it should be.
Right.
So the prospect of doing a draft is like, actually, what even is a draft? So one of the things, am I making sense?
Yeah.
So one of the things I think can be helpful is to actually to see, can you do a rough draft and submit it to someone and get their feedback? Because often what can happen is that person will say, actually, this is completely fine. You don't need to do anything.
Yeah.
So like practicing drafts, having a time limit, having some kind of validated criteria that says that this is enough for me.
Yeah.
So there might be another, like a myriad of other ways in which we can judge that. But I think that's an important thing to hold in the mind is like, just do your best what happens when I hear that?
Yeah, parameters. I love working within, like setting yourself like parameters, time parameters or whatever it might be. Like Lorne Michaels, who's the creator of Saturday Night Live in the States, his sort of famous quote is, the show's not ready when it's ready. It's ready when it's 11:30 Saturday night because they go live. So it's like there's no, like they have a finite amount of time. So it might get to 11:30 on Saturday night and they all know that it's not perfect, but they have to go to air. So it's ready. Like that is the parameter of that show. If they had a year to make it, it might be better, might not be, but they have no choice because that's the format of the show. And I love that. It's exactly what you're saying, like that set yourself a time parameter. And I often find if I have a week to do something or a month to do something, you're going to end up with about the same product, probably.
That's a really good reflection. Yeah. That's like this, like often like that. There's only like a 5% difference, like I mentioned before.
Yeah.
But the cost is really significant for that 5%.
Yeah. Yeah. Because you tweak and you tweak and you tweak. And you think, well, I've got time. I may as well keep changing it because the fallacy is that it will keep getting better if I keep working on it. But it's like that classic thing of a painter or an artist. It's like, when do you know when to walk away? Like you got to know when the right time is to walk away. When is it done? Because you could keep painting and make it worse.
And I'm going to be really philosophical here for a moment.
Please.
Voltaire.
Oh. Legend.
Do you know, I thought of Voltaren. I was like, Voltaren. Sorry, yeah, Voltaire. Yeah.
Well, no, one of like kind of a relatively famous quote of his is, "Perfection is the enemy of good." And I feel like that's actually kind of what sits at the key of what we're talking about here is that that the striving for perfection is actually compromising so much of our life.
Yeah. My mind's now thinking about the cost in being that you're at home for, like in my case, you're sitting there with your kids and you're not thinking about your kids. You're thinking about this same perfectionist thing that you're trying to get right over and over. So you're not engaging with them. You're missing the connection there. You're missing so much of everyday life. That, for example, with the month over, might be 5% better if you take a month over a week to do something because you want to get it perfect. But you spent a whole month ruminating and out of life. And missing out on the life that's going on around you and the connections in your life. And I think that's doesn't get much bigger than that, I think, as a cost.
And that's also why, although perfectionism isn't a clinical diagnosis, it's a feature of so many clinical diagnoses.
Right, yeah.
And,
such as?
Depression, anxiety, eating disorders, OCD, and addiction.
Right.
Very common feature. For lots of different reasons. But, again, kind of coming back to this, fear of failure, avoidance of shame, when we're constantly in that kind of striving, it really leads us down a very vulnerable path towards kind of, mental ill health. So I think that's really important to recognise that the cost is significant. And there's also associations in terms of our physical health, absolutely. And we might know, for example, that, after you've completed something really big, then often you get sick afterwards. Such an indicator of like the state of the nervous system.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
End of the year.
Yeah.
Last day of work. That's 3 years in a row I got sick at the Christmas party. I started to get sick at the Christmas party 3 years in a row.
Yeah.
Well, it was always going to be a big ep on the Imperfects when we talk about perfectionism. Probably makes sense to this.
I really hope this episode was perfect for everyone.
Yeah, we will definitely edit it a lot to make it perfect.
Or do we just embrace it and we just put this out as it is and go, here you go.
That would be
a good challenge.
Huge. Yeah.
Anyway.
Dr. M, thank you so much. Good to see you again.
Thanks so much for having me.
That was
Incredible.
just
So
amazing.
nice.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.
Awesome.
The Imperfects is hosted and produced by Hugh Van Cuylenberg, Ryan Shelton and Josh Van Cuylenberg. Our executive producer is Bridget Northeast. This episode was filmed by Andy Poole and edited by Jamison Moore.